Fungi, Bungi, Boogaloo. A 3-part short story. Part 1. It all started with a little he-devil, a child with no boundaries and parents too busy fighting about whose fault it was they were both equally miserable human beings. If they'd been paying any attention to the reason they'd come out for a hike in the mountains to begin with, they might have prevented little Wallace Statemanson from beginning the end of the world. All with the swing of a child-sized golf club. One of a set the little boy's father had gotten him so they could cultivate something in common as the years moved forward. Victor had had enough of childish things. He felt it was high time for him to start skill sharing with his son. Wally swung his club like a bat to the rhythm of his parents' argument as he strayed off on his own, unnoticed. He smashed the club end into whatever he could turn to carnage at the edge of the hiking path.
You always have excuses, too. I'm sick of them. Well, you're never on time. I'm never on time? Wow, that's real funny. Let's talk about being on time. Speaking of, did your friend get her pregnancy test back that you were so worried about for some reason? You know what? Two can play that game.
Wally strayed far enough into the woods that he couldn't hear the words they were saying, only the tones. An unsettled squirrel leapt higher into its tree, chattering aggressively as the child moved towards its home. The boy bared its teeth at the little critter. For a moment, he wanted nothing more than to reach up and show the noisy animal who was boss with the business end of his current tool of destruction. He swung upward, missing by about 10 times his height. As the club came down, a small family dodged his backswing, moving to the far side of the path to get around the reckless child. After making it safely past, they looked around for someone to blame for his bad behavior. The parents continued their bickering at the mouth of the hiking trail, as fellow hikers did their best to uncomfortably navigate around them, while pretending the toxic vibrations radiating away from the conversation didn't exist. What a pair. No wonder she looked haggard. No wonder his eyebrows furrowed so naturally. It appeared to be a feature, not an expression. The little rascal bum-rushed a tree trunk and smacked it so hard his hands released their hold. He screeched at the pain throbbing in his wrists. It died into a dull roar as swiftly as it had begun to sting. He composed himself and caught his breath before standing and cautiously picking up the club. He wrapped his hands around the base and clenched them tighter and tighter to the hold. His face grew angry and pinched. He started to growl and looked slowly from the weapon to the bottom of the tree he'd just attacked. It was standing in front of a small clearing, like a little sentinel, protecting the area beyond from any outsider. The foolish little knight was unfazed.
Rah!
He cried out, smacking the tree trunk a little softer than before as he dodged past it.
Ha-ha!
He shot a triumphant little fist into the air and laughed while hopping in a circle. And all at once, Wally stopped. His face dropped as he witnessed the scene his parents were making in the distance. Their voices were muffled, but their body language was amplified and clear. The pointing, the pushing, the yelling. Wally knew it all too well. He looked down without seeing the ground. His sight was obscured by teardrops gathering along the rim of his eyes, and droplets fell to the ground. Little fists of fury ball and tighten around the golf club. Wally's helplessness quickly converted to anger as he watched them. They wouldn't even know if I disappeared. Would it make things better if I did? The boy stared off into space, no longer seeing anything but the pictures playing out in his imagination, as he tried to imagine what life would be like without him in it. He wrinkled his nose. How do two people who treat each other like that end up stuck together? Wally frowned at the idea, deciding at that moment he would never get married. It looked awful. His eyes widened again. What did that say about him if he was made from them put together? Wally watched with a building distrust eating a pit into his belly. All the while, behind him, outside of his ability to see, a small cloud of iridescent brown dust sparkled and danced through the shadows. It appeared to be avoiding the light from sunflecks peeking through the canopy as it moved ever closer to the little child. The sparkling mass gathered and grew until it almost appeared to be an extension of Wally's shadow. It moved with him smoothly, predicting his motions or mirroring them somehow. It seemed to sniff at him above his head. As he continued to move animatedly, a tiny tendril reached out and touched the back of Wally's neck. Ah! He slapped a hand on his neck and drew it away to see what had landed on him, expecting a fly or a gnat. His eyes widened and then narrowed as he squinted in to get a better look. There was a slimy, iridescent smudge. He turned his hand, amazed by the way it shimmered. Gross, he whispered in awe. A small smile wove through his features. He'd smushed a lot of bugs in his day. None of them had smushed quite like this. He held his hand up into the light to get a better look, and just like that, the shimmering muck evaporated and sizzled into smoke, as if the ray of light had boiled and devoured it. Huh, must have been some weird kind of bug or something, Wally told himself. He wiped his hand on his pants and looked up to find nothing had changed between his parents. The argument was dying down, but still active. He slammed the golf club into the ground. The shadow of spores that had been observing him from behind, remaining close like a shadow, as if pretending to be an extension of him, exploded and disappeared as a new, smaller cloud of glimmering brown dust bursted above the mushroom top Wally's club had come down on. Wally frowned. He focused again on his father, grabbing his mother by the shoulders, getting close to her face to say what he was already speaking loud enough. Patience. Papa always tells me to be patient with the ball. Wally defiantly pursed his lips. His hold on the deadly baton tightened. He narrowed his eyes and bit his tongue till it hurt. Then he looked at his mother. She was yelling back and struggling fiercely to be let loose until she finally pushed his father hard in the chest. He stumbled a step backward, regaining his footing and returning full force. Mama tells me to treat my toys better, and they'll last longer. Wally watched his mom and dad. His emotions teetered between anger and sadness. A curious expression crossed his face as he put two and two together.
Just don't get it,
He puzzled, the frustration finally reaching a full boil.
Mama is more than a stupid golf ball, and Papa is way better than a toy.
His anger bypassed the sadness.
Why can't they just do what they tell me to? Why can't they be nice to each other?
The ground in front of the young child where his tears had fallen glimmered and glowed red for just a second, disappearing before Wally noticed. He smashed his golf club into the ground angrily.
Well, if they don't do it, why should I?
He showed his teeth and opened his mouth wide, pretending to yell and stand like each of them in turn. After a few turns of this, he started making funny faces instead of angry ones. It made him laugh to mock the scene. It felt less bad and more comical when he played out his own version of their arguments. His small mind made up their words as he went, as an unconscious coping mechanism.
You pooped so much that when I went in to brush my beard, all my nose hair I'd been working on so much just burnt right out of my nose holes.
Wally gasped and pretended to bat his eyelashes.
How could you say that? People can't know that about me. Who will be my friend if they know that I have fire poops?
Wally cackled at the musing. He smashed the club mindlessly into a pot of mushrooms as he play-acted. He was so immersed in playing pretend in the little clearing that he didn't notice the little clouds of brown dust forming in the air above the mushrooms he was breaking into mush. If he'd been listening just a little closer, he might have heard the cluster of fungi he was mindlessly beating yelling up at him.
Stop! You're hurting us! What did we ever do to you? We're for nourishment and mending, not pounding and abusing. What are you doing?
The little clouds lifted away from the mark like miniature atom bomb explosions. Each tiny particle moved away from its mushroom maker as if conscious of itself. Some grouped to form what appeared to be living organisms. Each mass was unique, with variations of arms, legs, wings, rudders, and any other method of motion you could possibly think of. It was magical, as if, together, the iridescent spores had silently decided on a form to reach, to get away together without hindrance from their predator. Others of the spores seemed determined to set off on their own, almost as if drawn, like metal to a magnet, somewhere beyond the clearing. The boy paused his repetitive motion and looked down. For the first time, realizing what he was doing and what it had led to. His eyes widened. The scene between his parents faded from his mind as he witnessed the wonder in front of him. The little puffs of fungi dust lifted and danced away in waves and spirals, always between motion, assuming the chosen form of each mass, revealing to the small child forms he'd never dreamed of. They floated away just under the canopy line in herds, while avoiding the splashes of vivid sunlight pouring through the gaps between the trees. Wally might have only lived 7 years and 2 months in his young life, but he'd learned enough to know what he was witnessing wasn't ordinary. It was extraordinary. A deep desire to smash every last cluster of the fungi took hold as Wally looked down at the shaded area surrounding him, plumb full of them. The little mushroom hats and dark blue bell-shaped blossoms sprouted through the shade, The only point there seemed to be none present in either variety was at the very center of the oasis, where the sun shone brightest through the branches and leaves. Wally squinted into the circle of light, seeing a small cluster of the animated spores climbing and swaying toward the ray until, poof, again, they combusted and rose into the air, spirals of smoke, just like the little splotch on his hand. The boy lifted a foot to find a pocket of smashed brown fungi. His face froze in a look of uncertainty and dislike. He looked at the bottom of his shoe to find a mush and goo clinging to the sulcus in the rubber bottom. Ugh. Wally wrinkled his nose, looking around at the lush pockets of fungi, just begging him to smash them to pieces. His hands tightened around the golf club. He could hear his parents calling his name through the grove behind him. A wicked smile formed over his face as his intentions solidified and he accepted the challenge. He posed the golf club, getting himself ready for a swing, just the way his father had taught him.
Wallace! Wallace!
Victor and Mallory searched the parking area and trailhead for their son.
I told you to keep an eye on him,
Mallory cried out.
Oh, how was I supposed to do that with you screaming at me and starting a fight in public? So fucking embarrassing.
Victor yelled across the lot.
Their exchange was interrupted as a young couple rushed from the mouth of the hiking trail, coughing and catching their breath.
They looked dirty.
They were well dressed, but covered in brown muck.
Victor immediately rushed to the aid of the newcomers.
Are you okay?
Victor asked. He jogged up to them and took off his pack, ready to help. Mallory rolled her eyes, outside of his view.
Oh, yeah, here we go. Here comes Superman. Can't keep track of his own son or pants zipper. But by George, you got an issue outside of the ones he's caused, please.
Her voice trailed off as Victor drew closer to the pair. Mallory turned her back on the scene, disinterested, and walked toward the edge of the woods, blown away that her husband could move so quickly from one issue to the next, while leaving so many loose ends, including his missing son. She started calling for Wally along the edge of the trees bordering the parking lot. The pair assured Victor that they were fine. They exchanged a meaningful look above his head, and the woman nodded and walked toward a white Audi parked close to the middle of the lot. Victor watched her. She looked over her shoulder and winked at him. Victor's cheeks flushed. He looked back at the man she'd run from the trailhead with. The stranger was squatting with his elbows on his knees. He was still trying to regain his breath, but his focus was trained on something beyond Victor. Victor followed the man's eyes to find his wife. He frowned. Victor's expression and sense of dislike for this new man deepened as a rush of possessiveness took hold. The stranger continued to watch Mallory shamelessly. Victor cleared his throat, interrupting the man's thoughts.
Did you happen to see a little boy by chance, on your way out?
The stranger scowled at Victor.
A little boy? About this tall?
He huffed as he indicated Wally's height with a hand. Victor nodded.
Does he happen to have a golf club?
The man's glower deepened. He stepped aggressively forward as he asked the question. Victor slowly nodded his head. His eyes strayed to the woman, wiping what appeared to be brown sludge from her frame before she slipped into the Audi's front seat and turned the rearview mirror toward herself. Victor squinted to be sure, but the substance appeared iridescent in the sudden overcast lighting. It glimmered from her face and a few strands of hair. The woman seemed absorbed in the task, not once looking up to notice him staring at her. Her motions seemed to slow down and become more fluid with each movement. It was almost otherworldly. Victor looked back at the man. He missed the woman's gaze flash toward him and follow him through the mirror as they continued their conversation. A strange feeling about the situation built as he asked again, "So did you see my son or not?" The man looked past Victor toward his wife. There was a hunger in his eyes as he watched her making her way toward the group. His eyes flashed back to Victor. A small and challenging smile crossed his features. The two stared at each other for an intense moment before the newcomer burst into laughter.
Yeah, we saw him. He's right through those trees, over there. Hell of a swing. I tried to tell him to stop kicking up so much of the dust shit, but he seemed like he was in his own little world.
The man chuckled and shook his head, his eyes still pinned to Mallory.
He's in a little clearing just up the trail and to the right.
The man's eyes shifted funny as he spoke. Victor had to squint through the light to be sure he was seeing it clearly, but one of the man's vivid green eyes had been watching Victor, while the other followed out of sync, watching Mallory as she made her way to the open door of the Audi. Victor followed his gaze. There was a car seat in the back Victor hadn't noticed before. The crinkle in his brow deepened as Mallory and the woman quietly exchanged words. They each held out a hand and shook, introducing themselves like civilized humans. The strange woman faced the two men. She nodded toward Mallory as Mallory spoke, but she stared into Victor, a small smile gathering over her lips. Again, he flushed. Victor looked back at the man, feeling strange and light on his feet. The entire scene felt fantastical. It didn't feel real. His heart beat at the bars of its cage. He heard it throbbing in his head as he cleared his throat to get the man's attention. The stranger didn't budge. He continued shamelessly staring past Victor, his expression unreadable. Victor hesitated, trying to get a better read on the man's intentions. "Sorry, I don't think I caught your name," he finally asked. The stranger smoothly transferred his attention to Victor. He flashed a smile and extended his hand, his eyes narrowing.
"You never asked."
He smiled charmingly.
"My name is Tim, and that treasure is my ex-wife, Bridget."
"Victor," he pointed carelessly.
"That's Mallory."
The two exchanged a handshake.
"Hey, Bridget,"
Tom hollered.
"do you want to show Victor here where we saw his son?"
Bridget stood up, eyes glued to Victor. Mallory blinked back, surprised. Bridget had just stopped, mid-sentence, and walked right past her as if she hadn't even existed. How quickly she'd shifted from their conversation. It was as if she'd been waiting for an invitation to leave. Mallory turned around, dumbfounded, and followed the mysterious woman with her eyes as she walked pointedly toward Victor. A prick of jealousy bit through Mallory's tough skin as she watched Bridget and her husband exchange a lengthy handshake. The two of them turned and walked together toward the hiking trail entrance. Victor laughed obnoxiously loud over something Bridget said. Mallory bit her lip, thinking, "Don't be silly. It's nothing. We just had a fight." Deeper, beneath the bitter taste, a sadness flooded her veins. The picture of a past version of themselves walking hand in hand toward a hiking trail somewhere in Hawaii. They were laughing. Discomfort trickled down Mallory's spine. She watched Victor walk toward the opening of the trail with some stranger instead of her, doing what they'd come there to do. The closer the pair drew to the forest's mouth, the more a new awareness crept in.
I wanted to say something before, but...
Mallory gasped and nearly leapt from her skin. She shifted on her feet to find Tim standing right next to her. He smiled. He'd been watching her at a distance and had somehow moved in closer without her noticing.
But I thought it might be inappropriate to mention my thoughts in mixed company.
I'm sorry, what?
Mallory didn't bite. She glanced at the forest entrance. It was empty. She frowned and took a step away as the man stepped closer, oozing confidence. Tim continued. You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. His eyes widened, as if he couldn't believe them or take in enough of the view.
I couldn't help but overhear your lover's quarrel.
Tim boldly stepped closer, closing the gap between them again. He bent down and whispered closer to her ear. You should know, if I was your husband, we'd never leave the house for different reasons. A thrill of excitement rushed through Mallory. She hadn't heard anything so passionate in ages, and so out of the blue. She stepped backward, looking up into the stranger's face. My name is Mallory.
I know.
The man's eyes flashed. He offered a hungry grin. Mallory held out her hand, not knowing how else to respond to the pointed attention. None of this felt real. Her mind was swimming in a space all of its own.
It's my pleasure.
He took her hand and kissed it softly, looking back at the forest entrance and then to Mallory with a devilish grin.
They're gonna be busy for a while. Should we find someplace quiet?
Mallory snapped out of the dreamy sensation. She frowned. Oh, what do you even mean by that? Tim smiled suggestively.
I think you know exactly what I mean.
He should be out there looking for my son. Her voice was full of exasperation. You told my husband you knew where he was.
Oh, no, she totally does. I'm sure it won't take long. They'll find him. I can promise you, the little guy is quite busy at the moment.
Again, Tim's eyes flashed uncomfortably. Mallory looked up at him in disgust. Is this like a thing you two do? Some fucked up freak fetish? Go out and hit on married couples, see if you can get them to go home with you? She backed away from Tim. Again, without missing a beat, he moved forward with her. Step off. Mallory pushed him back.
Okay, hey, see? We're good.
Tim held up his hands and stepped away. His lips formed a thin smile as she wiped the slimy substance from her hand onto her pants. Tim's smile and demeanor turned aggressive.
Now let's just see if your husband holds the same standards.
He chuckled and lifted an eyebrow. His voice oozed passive-aggressive sarcasm as he added,
Oh, and by the way, that little guy might just unleash hell if you keep neglecting him for a good fight. You should have seen him out there swinging away, banging shit up, ruining the forest's home.
The man turned and hissed the last sentence with a special viciousness. His green eyes flashed. And then... His green eyes flashed, and then he smiled, perking up.
Well, have a great afternoon, Mallory.
Tim's voice was strange, detached, and sing-songy as he swept toward the black sports car on the other side of the lot. Mallory snapped. She stomped after him. Are you accusing me of being a bad mother? She screamed.
Nope. Tim didn't flinch or turn to look at her. It wasn't an accusation, sweetheart, just a friendly piece of advice. He opened the door to his vehicle and slipped in. Oh, and here's another, since you asked so nicely. He leaned conspiratorially toward Mallory, one foot set comfortably on the ground outside of the vehicle as he pretended to pull something out of his pocket and blow it at her. Anyone so willing to go into the middle of nowhere with a pretty stranger while leaving their significant behind with someone who's clearly attracted to them, that isn't just asking for trouble. They're basically demanding it. Tim's smirk was damning. With that, he shut the door and rolled over the engine. The beast roared to life. Mallory was frozen. A form of shock sank deep into her bones. How had what a stranger said, who had all but just sexually assaulted her, how had it just hit such a nerve? Her eyes went far away as the sports car spun in a full circle at the end of the lot and made its way back toward her. The blacked-out window sank enough to reveal Tim's smug expression. One last thing. You are way too beautiful to be so ugly. His expression was dangerously close to pity. Why would you stay in a situation that does that to you? He looked her over as he disappeared behind the window again. Mallory gasped, not sure whether to be offended or angry. Then it sank in as he drove away, disappearing behind the towering pine trees, standing on either side of the entrance to the parking lot. It wouldn't bother me if I hadn't thought the same thing myself. The realization shot forward. The stranger had only been honest. Mallory clenched her fists, determined to go find her missing son. She turned toward the mouth of the forest and saw a small frame dragging a golf club. The treasured club was bent, and the end was twisted in the wrong direction. "Wallace?" Mallory called out as she jogged toward him. The boy continued walking at an even pace, saying nothing. Mallory made her way to Wally. Despite everything, she couldn't help but smile at his appearance. From a distance, it appeared he was covered in mud, or something. She reached out a hand, meant to touch his shoulder as they came together, but her fingers pulled back in horror before they met. "Wallace, what did you get into?" The clouds that had stayed in the distance most of the day had rushed in all at once. The sky was increasingly dark and gray. "Where's your dad?" Wally shrugged. Mallory's eyes bulged at the implication. She boiled inside. If Wally was here, and those two were still in the forest. She growled and grumbled to herself as she grabbed Wallace by the hand and pulled him along toward the car, determined to get out of there as fast as she could. The iridescent brown substance covering the boy drifted off into the wind as if it were nothing more than dust, though moments before it had appeared aqueous in nature. The spores flittered into the air and disappeared. By the time they reached the car, he was completely clean again. Wallace's eyes drooped. He was exhausted from the rampage he'd unleashed on the mushrooms in the clearing he'd left massacred behind him. Mallory opened the door and turned back to see him good as new. She frowned, her mind bending one too many times in a row to care. "Ugh, this day," she grumbled, relieved at the very least that she wouldn't have to scrub whatever that had been from her seats. Wally climbed into the back and laid his head against the window frame as she closed the door. Mallory started the car and pulled forward toward the exit.
Wait, Mom, what about Dad?
Wally straightened up. He'll be home later, she said through clenched teeth. Truth be told, she couldn't get back to start packing fast enough. His new friend can give him a ride home, she thought to herself. I'm done playing house. The ride home was quiet. Wallace fell asleep almost immediately, leaving Mallory to her thoughts. This was it. She was already planning her great escape. She was finally free to do whatever she wanted. Mallory sniffled and wiped her nose on the back of her hand and the sleeve of her jacket. She stumbled over pictures and images of times when all she'd wanted was to be doing with her husband what he was now doing with some hussy out in the woods. She glanced at Wally, fast asleep. 10 years down the drain so easily. She reflected more honestly. It had been heading that way for over half the time that they'd been together. Tears fell down her cheeks. She wiped them away and let out a sigh, looking into the rearview mirror for the 100th time to be sure Wally was still asleep. Rain started beating against the frame of the vehicle. Mallory turned on the windshield wipers, clearing away the mental images of her husband with someone else along with the torrents. She bit her lip and pushed harder on the gas. Her thoughts were louder than the wind and rain pulling and pummeling through their surroundings. She reached for the dial and turned on her nature sound disc she kept handy and took a deep breath, listening to the birds and the wind in the trees. Fresh start. This is a fresh start, she told herself. Through the rearview mirror, a small stream of glimmering spores swept over the surface of her clothing and reached into her nostrils, disappearing along with another deep breath. Mallory's body stiffened through the building darkness. A flash of lightning thundered and crashed around them. And after a few seconds, her body relaxed. Mallory closed her eyes, feeling a deep sense of relief. A sensation of perfect unity and peace poured through her, like she'd never felt before. Her eyes were still closed, and her foot pressed harder onto the gas pedal. The engine revved. The car shot over the winding road, smooth and in perfect unison with the curves in the road. Mallory exhaled. The car continued to drive perfectly between the lines. Her stranglehold on the steering wheel softened. A gentle smile slid over her lips. Her eyes finally opened as the car sped around the end of a steep curve in the road. Her pupils were dilated to fill the entire iris. She no longer showed any concern with the rearview mirror. Her eyes remained straight ahead. A new smile darkened her face. Her eyes flash again in a passing streetlight as the pupils dial back slightly, revealing vibrant green iridescent eyes where there had previously been brown. You're not the only one with a laundry list, Mallory purred under her breath. Time for Mama to get busy. To be continued. Thanks for listening, and please like and subscribe if you enjoy my content.